Test, test. What? How am I not getting audio? Oh, there we go. Yep. Okay. As I embrace my inner Brittany and learn to hate this thing. So, you guys did this yesterday with Garrett. The cool part about this particular one is that it basically spans all of the material for yesterday and for today. So really today what I want to do is kind of take the Rails AMA approach. When it comes to Ruby and Rails, you know, if we start listing off things like working with controllers, working with ERB, view and route helpers, routing, namespacing, nested routes, nested resources, like what are things that you are experiencing challenges with? What's fuzzy or gray or WTF about Rails, other than all of it? I was like, I could see Dan just like. Don't worry, you probably won't be the only one. Don't everybody speak at once. Pry? Oh, yeah, Pry is, yeah, it's kind of a REPL on steroids. The goal of Pry is that it's supposed to, I mean, really, have you ever worked with Python Tutor? Oh, okay. So Pry is basically the command line version of Python Tutor with extra debugging involved, so that you can actually like pause at each point and test and see what variables are. It's just understanding the difference between like stepping forward and going next. For example, stepping forward is if the next thing that's going to happen is running a method, stepping forward takes you into that method and lets you see each and every step of that method, whereas next is like, okay, the method has been run. So that's usually what causes people to, you know, kind of turn sideways when it comes to working with Pry. But yeah, Pry is basically command line Python Tutor and letting you output variables at each step, or run extra commands if you want to. Like it's a full IRB REPL, but it just has the next and step commands available to you. It also colorizes things very pretty. Shiny is good. So, in the interest of kind of prompting you, there's a pretty good list of topics that are related to Rails. Any of these jump out at you? Views or route helpers, or controller helpers or model helpers. Yes, okay. Okay. Which one would you like? Okay. So if we hop back, oh no, that's not it. Interesting. Oh, I think I nuked that one because it wasn't working. Bless you. Okay. So if I am looking at the structure of Jungle, there's an interesting folder right here called Concerns. And I think this is the one. Yeah, this is Vitahe. So concerns are interesting because they're more connected to active support than they are the rest of Rails. However, they're associated with your controllers. Have we covered modules in Ruby and what they do? No? Okay. So, concerns are modules, and these modules are meant to be used to enhance your controllers. So an active support concern, anything that would go in that folder, is going to be a module that gets included in your controller class. There's also model concerns as well, and they're meant to enhance the functionality of one of those particular things. And let's actually do a small example of just concerns in Ruby. Okay, so I'm going to make a parrot, and just for demonstration, it's going to make noise. And then I'm going to make, let's make a bat. I mean the flappy kind, not the baseball kind. Okay. Now, very different classes. Completely different animals. And really, if things came down to it, we likely would not be drawing too many parallels between these if we were just using real-world human logic. However, there is something that parrots and bats have in common. I know it's Friday. They can fly. But neither one of these can fly. Now, of course, I could totally give my parrot a method to fly and then be like, well, okay, that one worked there. So what we're going to do is we're going to add it there. And now both of my animals can fly. That is now wet code. Imagine instead of flying, this was computing the sales tax in southern Montreal, whatever it happens to be. Like, it might be more complex than this. It might be translating something into German. It might be pulling data from an API. Whatever my particular requirement is, I now have shared behaviors between these two classes. So what I would want to do here is, instead of doing that, I would want to define a module, and I'd want to call it flight. And inside my flight module, I'm going to define what fly can do. Make sense? And now, once I do the appropriate require so that I actually have that defined in memory, I'm going to include that in my class. And what this does is it enhances my class with some functionality. Because of the way that this is defined over here, seriously? It's defined as an instance method. So if we go one step further and we require relative parrot and require relative bat, then I can do this. And they both fly. So this is the basic principle behind Ruby modules. Ruby modules allow us to define a set of functionality. They can be it can be functionality defined at a class level. It can be functionality defined at an instance level. It can be literally just a set of helper functions that I think a class should be able to have access to natively. But if that is going to be behavior that I theoretically would want to inject in any number of classes in my application, I would define that as a module instead of just repeating that block of code from one class to another. So that's what a module does. And knowing that that's what a module does, with that digression, we can now hop back and we can talk about what a concern is. So a concern, this is the quote from DHH, David Heinemeier Hansson, the guy who actually wrote Rails originally. Concerns encapsulate both data access and domain logic about a certain slice of responsibility. They're a helpful way of extracting a slice of a model that doesn't seem part of its essence. What is and isn't the essence of a model is a fuzzy line in a longer discussion. Without going full bore on the single responsibility principle and running the risk of ballooning your object inventory. So if you can follow David's train of thought, and if you can, you have the potential to be a very rich person because his train of thought is on squiggly rails, pardon the pun. What he's really saying here is that our models, our controllers, are likely to have slices of their functionality which we may want to abstract out into a separate piece. And especially when we're talking about controller concerns, there are certain things that all of our controllers might need to do. So I'll give you a really good example, is logging or dealing with sessions, either way. So let's say we have this app and it's running, but we have a lot of traffic. So our app is actually spread over 3 different servers. 3 different instances are running our app. So Chris logs in, and when he logs in on server A. And so that's where his session gets set up, is in memory on server A. But he's like, oh crap, I want to get a cup of coffee before I use this. So he goes and gets a cup of coffee, comes back. The next time he hits a link, just because of the load on the server, he gets put over on, that link gets loaded from server B. Now they're all connected to the same database, so his user account is found, but now his session is gone. And so if that was the case, he'd have to log in again. That would suck. He'd be upset. So what we can do is we can take the sessions and we can also save them somewhere else. There are tools for doing this. Redis is one of the most popular tools for doing this, and Redis is basically just a big key value server. It's like a database server, but all it does is store keys and values for you. It's not about documents or records or tables or anything like that. You're literally just putting in a key and a value, and then you can look that up later. So in a case like that, let's say Chris first hit the home page because that was what he got right after he logged in, and then the next one was for the dashboard. So now we have 2 different controllers, a home controller and a dashboard controller. And we need both of those controllers to be able to have access to Chris's session data. So they could theoretically share the functionality of going to Redis and looking up his session. We would want to put that in a concern so that it's abstracted out, so that once we define that concern, it will automatically get included into both of the classes. and we just set up the functionality for retrieving his session data and put it there. And let's say that this is a government application that Chris is using. We also probably are going to have some logging. And every time, because it's government, every single time a record is accessed, we want to log it. Every single route that happens, every single click that happens, we want to log it because we are government and we are terrified of somebody doing something that we didn't keep track of. You think Google and Facebook are bad? No, 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 no. If you ever end up in the position of writing software for the government, 90% of your time will be spent figuring out how to log things. So that means every single model in our application needs to have a callback on it, that it's going to be an after find callback. And so when that callback happens, we're going to fire off a method to log that that particular instance of that particular model was loaded out of the database. And that's something we're going to do for every single model. So why would we go and write that code over and over and over again in every single model? We would define that functionality once, put it into a model concern file, and then that would get automatically included when all of our models were created. So that's what concerns do. And that is one of the ways in which we get helper methods in Rails, is we are able to define shared behaviors and take some slice of functionality from our application that we want, something that we need to be, as the name implies, concerned with, and we get to put that into a separate place. Does that make sense? Cool. Second kind of helpers. So there's actually if we go back to if we look in app, there's actually helpers there. And in fact, inside of app helpers, we have application helper, and it doesn't have anything in it. But what we do have is the fact that it's a module. Now that we know what modules are, we can figure out that on a resource-based basis, we can define helpers for each one of our resources. Now, built into Rails automatically out of the box is the resource of our application. That's why we have an application controller and, you know, an application layout and all those kind of good things. But we could define helpers for every single one of our other resources, and then they would automatically be included and be available. Now, the really cool thing about the helper methods that we can declare for our resources is that we get them everywhere. They have full scope everywhere. So let's say I had users. My users helper would be available in my models, it would be available in my controllers, and it would be available in my views. So we can define helper methods that are associated with those things and have them have full scope. Super helpful, but this often gets abused by Rails developers, usually new Rails developers, because they're like, oh, well, that's just a helper method, I'll just put it over there. Sometimes it is way more useful to have a method on the model, because then with a helper method, you have to pass the data you need into it in order for it to work. A method that's already on an instance of the model or already on an instance of the controller can access the data from inside that object. So it's a lot easier at that point. So these are helper methods when you would want to do things like, oh, let's see. Well, do you remember on your week 2 test when you had like the capital case function? You know, that kind of stuff where you have a specific formatting task that has to happen. Let's say you pull the phone number out of the database and it's just a string of 10 digits. But you want to format that as 3 numbers in the area code space, 3 numbers for the exchange, dash, and then the last 4 numbers. So you want to, you have a formatting function for doing something like that. That's the kind of thing that you would put into a helper. So that's the second kind of helper. Third kind of helper that we get is the one that's our routing helpers. There we go. So down the left-hand side here, we have a column labeled prefix. So prefix, it has its name because whatever text is in that column is going to go before either underscore path or underscore URL. And if you are doing underscore path, then it's going to return a relative path that is whatever route it's associated with. And then if you're doing underscore URL, you're going to get http:// mysupercoolapp.com/ whatever the path is to access that particular route for that resource. So it's prefixed because there are 2 methods created for every one of those routes that has a prefix. Some of them, like this one, don't have a prefix. That means you don't have a helper method for those. But Rails automatically creates these based on your routes. So for example, if I look in here, anything where I have said resources, Rails is going to create 9 routes unless I specify something more specific, like an only, or an unless, or sorry, except. So anything that comes out of this, generally that is a get route, is going to get a route helper method associated with it. And Rails just dynamically defines those so that when my app runs, I will have a products underscore path and a products underscore URL method just automatically there. And that's where I can redirect somebody to. It's also the method that I can use to populate a link to, which is a view helper, which is the 4th kind that we'll get to in just a second. Now, where these get used a lot, you should be using them anytime you're doing a redirect to in your controllers. You want to use the route helper that's associated with that. Couple reasons for doing that. One is it keeps you from having to remember an exact path. The other thing, the reason you want to do that is you may have libraries, gems installed in your application that might modify the actual path that someone's going to get redirected to. For example, you may have marketing tools installed so that every single time somebody goes to a URL, you get some query string on the end that's keeping track of their path through the site. So if you have that kind of gem installed, it's going to modify automatically the behavior of the underscore path and underscore URL helpers. So if you use the method, you will get the right path in that link. And then the other case where you're going to use them is, let's say, for example, Chris is logged in. He went to get his coffee. By the time he came back, his session timed out and he needs to log back in. And I don't know, somewhere between the coffee machine and here, he picked up a horrible heroin habit and he's forgotten his password, because that would totally happen. Maybe he hit his head and he's forgotten his password. So he clicks on forgot your password and he gets an email sent to him by Action Mailer. And in that email is a link that he can click on that will redirect him back to the page where he can change his password. And if I'm filling out the ERB for that email template and I need to put in that URL, I'm going to need to use the underscore URL helper so that when he clicks on it, it directs him back to the site, because I can't use a relative path at that point, because then I'm giving him a relative path according to Gmail, not according to my application. The other time you'll use underscore URL helpers is if you're running your app as an API. So somebody is making an API request to your app and you're sending them back JSON. Like maybe, for example, somebody's looking up a user via API. You're sending them back a JSON object, at user.json or to JSON. And so you're sending them back that JSON object, and maybe you have a link to their profile. Maybe you have a link in there to their avatar, something like that. If you're sending them that to their application outside of yours, you'd want to use the full path in there so that theoretically they could turn that into a link that you could click on. It shouldn't be that client's responsibility to figure out which domain someone should be sent to. You can just send that data to them by using the underscore URL method in how you populate that object. So route helpers are remarkably useful in that regard. That's the third kind of helper. Last kind of helper, let's go for this one. Last kind of helper are view helpers. Now we've got two right here at the top, which is why I picked this one. Line 3 and line 4 have two of your most frequently used view helpers in them. The first one is link to. In Rails, you are never going to build an A tag manually. That's just not done. Yes, you can do it, but it's just not done because we have link to. Link to will automatically do the magic of building an A tag that goes to the right place. Now, the interesting thing about link to as a helper method is it's very smart. In this case, we have linked to a product. So this is the partial that gets looped over and actually displays the product on the Jungle page. So when we link to a product, I'm actually passing an instance of the product class to link to. And link to is going, oh, I know what that is. That's fine. This is a resource in my application. Therefore, if I'm linking to that product, I'm probably linking to the show page for that product. I know what the path is going to be, /product/ID, and I'm going to grab the ID from this object and put that into the href. So link to is smart enough to be able to take either a string as the destination, or you can pass it an instance of a class, or you can link to and then use one of your route helper methods, which will just return a string, and link to is like, yeah, cool, no problem. But link to also allows us to do some other stuff, as we can see here on line 12. So here we are actually using the helper method. Now this particular helper method, add item to cart path, requires in the URL, like in the path, it requires two IDs. One for the product, or actually, no, sorry, it does just require one. It requires the product ID in there. So we can pass that. We could pass it as product ID. Truthfully, we could just pass product in here and it would work. And so that's one of the other cool things about the route helpers, but we're linking to that. But we're also adding an HTML class, a button primary, and we are doing method put. So we can, with a link to, pass hash configurations to it that will change its behavior. By the way, in the world of Ruby, just so you know, this is one parameter being passed to link to, comma, all of this is a second parameter. That's interpreted as a single hash. So that's not 3 parameters being passed to link to. It's only 2 because the second one is being interpreted as a hash. The do block here is allowing us to embed an icon inside the link. Anything that's in a do block that is passed to link to gets yielded into the body of whatever goes inside the A tag. That's how that works. So, did you guys go over how this kind of method overriding works yesterday? There's a little bit of magic to it. Okay, so let's copy this. Let's hop over to Sublime. So here we have this link to, and what it's actually going to generate is, I don't know, whatever that route would have been. Add product cart, add item cart, cart/add item. Okay. And what was it? A shopping cart. Okay. That's the actual HTML that's getting created. And I can guarantee you 100% that if I was a user and I clicked on this link, my client would send a request through to the server, and the server would interpret that as a put request. In fact, the actual request that would be sent from my client would have the HTTP verb of put set. How? Clicking on a link produces a get. Nope. Data attributes are HTML5 attributes. They allow us to add data dash whatever and store data in a DOM node. They are purely there for data storage. How do I end up getting a put request on my server from clicking on this link? If I told you that you had to build something, build an application that would allow you to click on a link and send through a put request to a server, other than flipping the table and walking out, what would you do? The route's already there on the server. The put route's already there. No, I don't need a form, but you're starting to head closer to the right direction. Because forms technically only submit get or post. So if I want this to send to the server with a different verb, there's only one way that I can do it. Does that look familiar? Where do we know that from? I'll give you a hint. It starts with J and rhymes with query. Yeah, there we go. You guys are good. It's almost like you knew the answer right on the tip of your tongue. So perhaps I could have something like this. Oh, and let's add one more little bit. Seem pretty straightforward? Yep. That's how this works. That's also how the ones that are delete links work. And then they'll also, if we were to change this to a delete, because we changed the method here, typically you'll also see this. You'll see that get added to the link. And you'll have data confirm equals are you sure? Confirm is just a function in vanilla JavaScript. And what it allows us to do is pop open a box in the browser that asks a question and then gives us OK and cancel. OK returns true, cancel returns false. I can make those happen pretty easy. Apparently there's a lot of ads on this page. There's a confirm box. It's like an alert, but it has an extra button. And I get true back. So yeah, this is the magic behind what goes on in the client. You have to remember, did you guys look at the asset pipeline? Like how the JavaScript link, script tags and the style sheet link tags work? Oh, cool. I get to show you that. That'll be fun. One of the things that gets loaded into every single Rails app by default is jQuery. It's actually a challenge if you're using like Rails and ERB and some kind of view helper. Rails really wants that set of jQuery to be on the front end, because Rails has its own jQuery library that it uses to do a bunch of really interesting things. And so this is close to what is in that Rails jQuery library that's loaded on every page. And so it allows you, if your anchor tag has been generated by the link to method, it allows you to do all this extra magic attached to it. So the other one I was mentioning was image tag. Now, image tag is a method that is going to generate an IMG tag for us, so we don't ever have to use IMG as a HTML tag in Rails ever again. Kind of nice. And all the same reasons for using link to, the same reasons for using the route helpers apply to image tags. You may have a library included in your Rails app that is doing things like creating thumbnails for you. So this image tag is going to work with that and produce an image tag that links to the right image. The other reason for doing this, and it'll be the next thing we'll get into after the break, is this thing I just called the asset pipeline. When you include script files and you include style sheets and you include images in Rails, typically you're putting these things into the assets folder. And when you actually run Rails in production, what Rails does is it does a process called concatenation, meaning it crunches all your script files together into a single file, crunches all your CSS down into a single file, and then it does minification, which is stripping out all of the unnecessary white space so that it is the smallest possible file to be able to send to the client. That reduces the size of the HTTP requests that your client has to make. And so image tags, what it does is it creates, for that particular build, a version of that image that's used for that build, and the file name has a particular hash in the file name. So it will be able to tell, let's say that it was your logo image and, I don't know, you were, let's say, Slack, hypothetically. And let's say you changed your logo this week. Never happens, I know. And you want to make sure that the next time somebody loads your page, 100% guaranteed they're going to get the new image. So it's not just doing logo underscore v underscore 2.png and letting that be the link. Because it's a different image, it gets a different hash automatically added into the file name. And that way it's guaranteed that this is a unique file name, and all you've ever named it is just logo.png for you. But when it actually gets served up to the client, it has a different file name in it, and Rails automatically fills that in when you use the image tag. Cool. This one here, the FA icon helper method, only exists because we have the Font Awesome gem included, but this is a view helper. So this is one that gives us that font icon being displayed inside our link the right way. And there are a lot of libraries that you add. Bootstrap is a great example, that by adding that library into Rails, you now add extra view helper methods that you wouldn't have had before. This is another helper method, the humanized money with symbol. That's coming from the money library that's added in, so that according to whichever currency we are looking at, it actually creates a currency number that a human being can read. Because the way Ruby tends to do numbers, Ruby numbers tend to look like this, which Ruby interprets with no problem as 1 million. But cool. So that gives us the 4 different kinds of helper methods in Rails. Any questions on those? Go take a break. When you come back, we'll talk about the asset pipeline. All right, so I said that what we were going to do is talk about the asset pipeline. So let me define that term real quick. When we're dealing with a web application like Rails, we are dealing with two very distinct sets of data. We have dynamic data. That's the data that's coming out of our database, that's going into, coming out of our models, going into our views. That's dynamic data. We also have static data. Every web anything has static data. Images, CSS files, JavaScript files. Generally, those don't change. Once we define them and then we put them up on the server, they're not going to change until we upload a new version. But the data that's going into the application, that's going into the database, that might change frequently from the use of the app. But typically the CSS isn't going to change from somebody just using the app. So what production web applications have done throughout history is had a way to maximize the effectiveness of those static assets. And that's what the asset pipeline is just an engine built into Rails that does its best to maximize the effectiveness of the static assets. So if we look at the in app views layouts application.html.erb, we have these two tags at the top, style sheet link tag and JavaScript include tag. These are view helpers. So the asset pipeline is triggered by the views. And we see that the first parameter is it's named application. And then media all is something that gets passed to the style sheet link tag, because we can have different style sheets for different media that our site might be displayed on. For example, media print. You can have specifically a style sheet for how your content is presented when it is printed. Very useful, by the way. And then on both of them, we see data turbolinks track. Does anybody know what turbolinks is? I promise it is not your newest anime superhero. So turbolinks is I want to say this politely, it's a feature of Rails. When it first started being used, it kind of blew people's mind because it sped up Rails dramatically. And at the same time, it made every jQuery developer in the world want to punch a kitten. So what turbolinks does is, when we're looking at this view file, we know that the main part of our content, for example, is going in here at line 14 where the yield is. That's where our view files are going to get yielded in to the application, which means that the rest of it probably isn't going to have to change. If you think about Jungle, the header bar stays the same, the footer stays the same, and all that changes is the content in the middle. So Rails takes the mentality of, well, if that part of the content isn't going to change, why should we reload it? So what turbolinks is a library that every time a new route is loaded from the front end, it sends the request to the server, and by default, unless you put an extra parameter in your link to, Rails automatically sends through a parameter with the links that tells the server to treat it as a turbolinks link. So what the server will do is it won't reload the entire layout. It will only render the view part, and it will send that fragment of HTML back up to the client, where it will just get injected back into place where that yield would go. So what that means is, if I load the home page, it's only the home, index.html.erb that's getting rendered. Well, home for Jungle is the products page. So products index.html.erb, that's the only HTML that gets rendered if I go back to the home page. The first time I load the site, obviously it has to load everything. But every link, bless you, that I click on after that, it's only going to render the inner part of the site. That's less content that has to be transmitted, therefore it's faster. Awesome. The problem with that, and the reason jQuery developers hated it, is it doesn't create a document ready event anymore. which if you don't have a document ready event, how do you bind all of your actions to the content that just loaded on the page? So they had to come up with a way to deal with that, and they did. This, by the way, this third one here, I don't want to gloss over this. CSRF meta tags, that typically gets read as CSRF, stands for cross-site request forgery, and outside of SQL injection is another one of the top 10 web vulnerabilities. Cross-site request forgery is the process by which someone is able to submit a request to your site that is not coming from a page on your site, but make it look like it's coming from a page on your site. So let's say, for example, that we had a form to register a new user. And somebody looked at that form, inspected the code, saw what the name of the input values was, saw the route that it was going to post to, and they built their own form, but added an extra thing that was going to send through admin true when creating that user. That would, theoretically, they could just fill out that form a whole bunch of times or have a bot automatically send that data in, and they could create a whole bunch of admin users for themselves on your site. Rails is strong params also helps with that, but let's say it wasn't Rails. Let's say it was just some random PHP site that, somebody built in their, basement and thought that it was the best thing ever and couldn't understand why they were getting hacked every other day. Doing that is cross-site request forgery. So what CSRF meta tags does is it creates a set of tags in the header, the meta HTML tags, that help prevent that forgery from happening. And also the form helpers that are part of the view helpers. There's also the CSRF tags that go into there where you get an extra hidden input that has a long hash in it. Every time a form is generated in Rails, Rails will create an extra key in your session that is saying, hey, this form is actually legit if it has this hash value in it. So when the form gets submitted, Rails compares those hash values, and if they match, it allows the form to be processed. If it doesn't match, then it assumes it's CSRF and it rejects the form. So that's a security measure. So I'm going to go to app assets style sheets application.scss. And that's not the one I wanted. Really? Fine, I'll look at the application, or the JavaScript one. There we go. So, this is the application.js file that is in app assets JavaScripts. And you'll see that it's just full of comments. There's no JavaScript code in here. And it tells you this is a manifest file that will be compiled into application.js, which will include all the files listed below. So any JavaScript or CoffeeScript files that are in that list of directories, lib assets JavaScripts, vendor assets JavaScripts, or app assets JavaScripts, will be referenced here using a relative path and pulled in and made into a single file in the order in which they were indicated. And then I want you to read these two lines because I don't want it to ever be said that Don never pointed this out. It is not advisable to add code directly here. But if you do, it'll appear at the bottom of the compiled file. So just because it says, but if you do, it won't break things, does not give you permission to do it. They tell you it's not advisable to do it, so just don't. Files are free. Make another file and put your code in there and have it be loaded into the right place. So we see that there's require jQuery is the first one. So it's going to require in the jQuery library, which is already built into Rails, require jQuery _UJS. that is the Rails specific library with all the jQuery code that does like the method stuff that I was pointing out and the confirm stuff that I was pointing out. jQuery_UJS is Rails's library that has all that stuff in there. If jQuery_UJS is not there, you won't get that functionality out of Rails. Plain and simple. Require turbo links. We just talked about what that was. Require bootstrap sprockets. So this app has the bootstrap gem included in it. And sprockets, you can see it says read the sprockets readme. Sprockets is the name of the engine that does the process of assembling the JavaScript and CSS files. And then the last one we see here is require tree dot. So that is doing what you hopefully are intuiting that it's going to be doing, which means it is requiring everything in the current directory. So whatever is in app assets JavaScripts is being included. Now this is, there's actually a term for doing this. It's called slurping. I'm not making this up. It's a real thing. You can Google it. Because it's literally slurping up the entire directory and loading it in here. Now, require tree dot is great if you are not picky about the order in which your JavaScript files get loaded. If there is a specific order that they have to go in, you then have to be careful about the naming. And here's why. So let's say that we have a.javascript, b.javascript, c.javascript, and abba.javascript, because everything is named after something in the JavaScript world. So we have these 4 files, and we want them to be in our app. All 4 of these files are in the right directory, and that's great, except the way Linux sorts files, this one's going to come first. Capital letters come before lowercase letters. And you're like, well, that doesn't work because ABBA needs a.js and b.js to be in place before we can, have the Dancing Queen library. So here's what you do. You're like, okay, great. I'm going to solve that this way. And so I'm going to go back and I'm going to spend the 15 minutes of manually renaming every single one of my files and making sure they're in the right order. Sounds great. Until you get down to number 10. Because in the Linux world, this one goes there. Ah, no, why are you doing that? Stop that. That goes there. That's the way things get sorted. And so you're like, okay, that's not right. I don't like that. So then you start naming things this way. And you're like, ha, I have solved my problem. And you've also just wasted a whole bunch of extra time. I told you guys on Wednesday, in Rails, if you're doing something that seems like it's hard, you're probably doing it the wrong way. So what you do in that case is you come down here and you get rid of that line. And you say, and you put them in the order in which you want them to be there. Saves you tons of time. And then if you have a new file that comes in, you can go and put it exactly where it needs to be in the load order, or just stick it in at the bottom. So here's the other place where this will come into play. Now the reason we don't have the application.css manifest in this app, and I didn't think about this, is because this one's using Sass. So with Sass, we build our own manifest. That file that you import everything into in Sass, that's a manifest file, because that gets compiled into a file before it ever gets used by the application, right? So it is already a manifest file. But if you were just using CSS and you weren't using Sass, the CSS one also has a require tree dot in it, which is awesome until you think about CSS specificity. Later rules are more important than earlier rules in CSS. So if you need your CSS to be loaded in a particular order, then get rid of require tree in the manifest file and put the files in the order in which they need to be loaded. Save yourself the grief. In fact, I know a lot of Rails devs that when they start a new project, the very first thing they do is they get rid of require tree dot, just because it ends up being a pain in the ass for certain things. But it's usually once your app grows, because when we start off, we tend to put all of our JavaScript in one file and all the CSS in one file, and we're like, yeah, it'll be fine, I'll fix it later. And then of course later comes, and we're like, oh my God, why did I do this? But yeah, just save yourself the time and put things in the order in which you want them to go in. So that's the asset pipeline. Now, two things about the asset pipeline that you want to know. One is that when you are in the development mode, everything that has a require line in here, and I guess these would technically have that. Everything that has a require line in here in development environment will get a script tag on the page because it's going to load them all separately. In production, all of that gets squished down to a single JavaScript file. So that behaves differently depending on which environment you're in. The other thing that's interesting that will happen is that when you are in the production mode, what will happen is it will build a JavaScript file that looks like assets application-.js. And that's a hash. And this is a cache buster. So just like I talked about with the logo for Slack, it would have some hash attached to the file name. This is the name of the file that Sprockets will compile in order to represent the current state of your JavaScript. If you change your JavaScript and then relaunch your app in the production environment, that hash will change, which guarantees that your users will get the most current JavaScript and not the old JavaScript file because it has a unique file name. So this is, we call it a cache buster. It's a unique value that gets attached to a file name that prevents old files from coming up when the page loads. So both your CSS and your JavaScript will have this on there in production. So don't get freaked out by that. If you see it, you're like, oh my God, you mangled my JavaScript, you mangled my CSS. No, it's actually kept it from getting cached by the browser. Cool. So that gets us through that stuff. What else? Nested resources, one of my favorites. Okay. So, this one's a bad example. Let me see if I have another one. This one is not the best example. Okay. Let's actually we'll do this. Rails new. Oh, he does? Wunderbar. Okay. Config. Routes. Okay, yes, this one here. I mean, I kind of wanted it so that I could do rake routes with it. Okay. So here's the thing with nested resources. It's not just about building more complicated paths. Nested resources are intended to show the relationship between the resources. So for example, users and posts. If this was a blog or, a journal. So we've got journals and entries. There's a relationship there. At the database level, at the model level, we have a one-to-many relationship. One journal has many entries. And if I want to be able to load up a journal. So let's say I'm going to journal 27. Then what I expect to see at that page is I expect to see the data about that particular journal. What I don't expect to see is all of its entries. From a RESTful perspective, this URL, this path, should reflect the state of the data being transferred. So if I want to be able to see the entries associated with that journal, then from a RESTful perspective, it makes sense that I would want to go to this address. But this is actually two parts, two RESTful parts connected together. So, it is adding those two RESTful tokens together. REST as a basic level, is these 4 tokens. This is the pattern of REST that we have. So what we have here is we have this token /noun/ID, so journals 27. So we have this one plus this one. And then that very specifically from a RESTful perspective represents the context of the entries as a resource that are associated with the journal whose ID is 27. So everything we do when it comes to path building in REST is about adding context to the data that we're going to be viewing. Same thing that we see with namespacing. For example, if I go to admin, journals 27, it is the same data as this route right here. I'm accessing the same database record. I'm accessing the same model. But what I've done is I have changed the context in which I am accessing that data. So that's what path building and nested resources and namespaces, they're all just one big category of stuff that we do. And the whole purpose of it is to give us the right context for the data we're accessing. So if I'm, the difference between /journals and /journals/27, they're actually both, the top one is going to contain the data of the second one. I'm just focusing my context. I'm being more specific in the context that I'm doing because I have now added to that path. And then if I do /journal/27/entries, I'm still looking at /journal/27, but now specifically I'm looking at the entries, which is associated data in that context. And then if I go /admin/journal/27/entries, I'm now in the context where, in this case, I am administering the entries that are associated with the journal whose ID is 27. So what nested resources give us is just that ability to, nested resources and namespaces allow us to refine that context. And then when we are path building using resources, I could take that further because I might have resources journals do, resources entries, and I might have only, index and, what else would I have? I forget exactly what the list is, but, there's only certain ways in which that context would make sense. If I'm looking at a specific entry, if I'm looking at /entry/13, does not matter what journal that's associated with at that point, because I'm just looking at that specific entry. Similarly, if I am editing that entry, doesn't matter which journal it's associated with. If I am deleting that entry, doesn't matter which journal it's associated with. So there's only certain ways in which that context makes sense. And that's why we have what's called shallow nesting. So shallow nesting allows us, if I do this, I think it's only index, new and create routes that work there. And then we would have outside of that, So this would be in our routes file. We could type this all out this way. This shows us what's happening, but there's a better way to do it because this is too much work for Rails. What we do in this case is we just say shallow true. So it's what we call shallow nesting, where this builds that right set of paths that show the right context for the relationship between these two things. My index, my new, and my create are going to be nested paths, like journals/id/entries/something. Whereas the show, the edit, the update, and the delete are just /entry/id/verb by themselves. So that's shallow nesting, and that's just another nice little magic way that Rails gives us to manage this relationship between our resources. Now, nested resources can get pretty deep. Like we might have journals/entries/comments/reviews/whatever. Generally, anything past 3 is considered bad. In fact, even 3 levels of nesting is kind of unwieldy. There's certain cases where you might actually legitimately have that, like project/user/ something. That would kind of make sense. But yeah, anything past 3 really gets ugly because you get great big long URLs when you actually have to manage that. But yeah, with the shallow true, Rails automatically creates all the params in the URLs and automatically creates the path helpers for you and everything else. It just fairy dust magic. Does that help? Make that more sense? Cool. Next question. We have like 20 minutes. Any other topics you want to cover? You guys went over the form helpers, right? Yeah? Okay, good. The difference between like form tag, form for, form with. Well, form with is new. You don't have to worry about that one yet. That's in like Rails 5.2. Yeah, forms suck, so never write them. If you can get something to write them for you, do that. Pro tip. Product ratings. Maybe even do some code up here and show you how those work. Yeah, I might have been born in the morning. It wasn't this morning, sorry. But let's think about what's going on. You have a product model. You have a ratings model. These represent, individual data collections points. And what you want to be able to do is to create a new rating each time a user interacts with a control. So that will add a row to a table. And then in order to figure out what the rating of the product is, when you load that product, you would load up all of its ratings and, I don't know, maybe take advantage of a SQL thing called average. Sounds good. I might do that. And then that would be part of my query that I would run in my controller and put that into an instance variable and push that to the view file. Or if I was being really smart, I would go to my product model and I would make myself an instance method that would automatically compute the average rating for that model, for that instance of that model. And so then when I'm displaying it in the products partial, I would just have to say product.average rating, and it would automatically make that number for me. Just a thought. Like literally it would be 3 lines of code in the model. So Cool. Um, yeah, I'm kind of out of initial inspiration in terms of just talking about general stuff with Rails. I will say this particular project, Garrett's done a grotesquely good job of putting together examples of all of the key major features of Rails. Use this as a blueprint of like how to do this. Um, I mean, Garrett's a grad, and I'm continually just impressed by that guy. He's done a really good job with this. So definitely, if you are feeling stuck or you need inspiration about how something should be done, this project is really well built, and so you can use it as a reference for stuff. The other thing that I will say is especially with Rails, if you're thinking about next week, because today is a good day to start thinking about next week. If you're thinking about next week and thinking, you know what, this Rails thing might not be so bad on the back end of my final project, if you want to start doing the research into the types of gems, the types of packages and libraries that you would want to include. The reason I say that is because most people who like Rails come out of this week going, oh, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to use Rails as an API. I'm going to use React on the front end. That's not as straightforward as you might think. It is totally possible. Once you get it set up, works great. But I am not even exaggerating. There are 4 different ways to do it, to connect React and Rails together. You can have them as 2 completely separate applications, very similar to what we did with Chatty. You can have them be all part of one application using the React-Rails gem. But you have to read how to do that because it doesn't just work out of the box. A lot of Rails stuff is magic, but when you start bringing in other technologies, they may not be quite as magic as Rails. The intention is always there. You can also just literally load the React JavaScript file manually and have the JSX compiled when the page loads. Load in React DOM, have your view files contain your JSX, get them served up to the client, have them parsed by the client and compiled manually. You can do that. The 4th way is that you can have all of your React compiled on the server before it ever gets pushed to the client. That's what we call pre-rendered or isomorphic applications. So there's 4 different ways to do it, and it's not something you're just going to be able to power through in an hour starting next Wednesday. So definitely focus on doing some research. Also, if you don't have a good idea yet for your final project, you're not behind. If you don't have a group yet for your final project, you are not behind. This weekend is a good time, though, to start marketing ideas and marketing yourself and, buying people drinks. The last thing I want to say is regarding next Monday, Monday and Tuesday. So the thing is, you're going to be done with Rails, and you know that your final projects are coming up, but then Lighthouse has this crazy thing where we actually expect you to pay attention to the content on Monday and Tuesday of next week. I know. Why would we do that? You want to just get to your final project. Please, I'm going to ask you from the bottom of my withered little heart, please do not start coding on your final project until later next week. You're not getting ahead. You're not going to impress more employers by writing an extra 20 lines of code that don't work and you're going to have to refactor them later anyway. You're actually taking away from your opportunity to learn something cool. Monday and Tuesday of next week is where we show you how unit testing works with Ruby and with Rails. So I know that we haven't had the biggest focus on testing so far in the course. We've shown you how testing works when it comes to you taking the tests in week 1 and week 2, and how Mocha works in that case, and assert and things like that. But we're going to focus on it a lot more because we're going to show you how you can test the features that you put into Jungle and make sure that they work. Don't just gloss over this. Don't zone out. Now's not the time to watch, like catch up on Titans on Netflix or whatever. Like, actually pay attention to this stuff because very much like Git, very much like, knowing what good clean code looks like, knowing what good testing looks like is something you're going to be expected to know when you walk into day one of a job. So definitely take the time to pay attention to this. And I will say that the final projects that are able to stand up in front of employers and go, oh, and by the way, we have a full test suite that proves this works, are the ones that make the employers sit bolt upright, their eyes widen, and they start writing checks. Because most people don't take the time and the care to do that. So if you pay attention on Monday and Tuesday and really work through and absorb that content, that is what is going to set you ahead in terms of impressing employers, not spending 2 days coding on your final project because you just want to get ahead of everybody else. And this testing stuff, who does that, right? Think about this. You buy a new car. You know, you walk over to the, let's say the Mitsubishi dealership, you buy yourself a brand new Lancer, everybody's happy, you're driving down the road, and you go to put your foot on the brakes and the pedal goes straight to the floor. And of course, you crash into something and everybody's unhappy. And your first thing is going to be like, oh my God, didn't you test this? Do you really want the dealership to go, we just wanted you to drive fast? No. You know, we're totally expecting the cars we drive and the blenders we make our smoothies in and the building we're standing in, we expect all this stuff to have been tested and safe and ready for us to use. Did you even think about whether your banking app was tested or not when you installed it on your phone? Probably not. Probably didn't even cross your mind. Oh, here's all my financial security and details. Please take it all. That's only if you're using a Huawei phone, but too soon? Okay. Yeah, so the moral to the story is pay attention to the testing because that is what sets developers, products, entire companies apart, is the ones that do good testing on their products. So I would encourage you to not just gloss over it. If you haven't finished Jungle yet, please try and get it done, though, this weekend. You don't want that lingering over your head. If you have any other apps, projects, assignments outstanding, please take this weekend to clear all of that stuff up so that you are hitting next Wednesday with nothing, no shadows looming over your head. At that point, we want you to focus 100% on your final project. So do your best this weekend to get yourselves caught up and feel really good about where you are and what you're about to be able to contribute. Don't worry if you're going into the final project, though, feeling unsure about things. You're supposed to. That's the point of giving you 2 weeks to work on the final project and build up all those skills that you're not sure about yet. You are not supposed to feel perfect like a senior dev yet. That comes in about 7 years. So be patient with yourself, but set yourselves up the best you can this weekend to be able to go into Wednesday and nail everything. Yeah, Nick. Yes. So an overview of the next 2 weeks. So Monday and Tuesday, 100% regular days. Standard boot camp. You'll have a lecture in the morning. You'll work all day. The Monday and Tuesday, though, you don't have breakouts. Week 8, there are no breakouts for Monday and Tuesday. So you will just be working on the RSpec, which is the testing library, and you'll be doing RSpec for Ruby, and then you'll be doing RSpec for Rails over those 2 days. Wednesday, you'll have lecture in the morning. It will be a more detailed version of the project planning lecture that you had for starting your midterm project. That will be your final project kickoff. From that point until week 9, day 5, so the following Friday, you will have lecture in the morning, and the entire day will be spent in group working on your final project. So just to be clear, there will still be lecture every day, looking at you, Nick. There will still be lecture at 9 o'clock every single day for the next 2 weeks. But they will be the advanced lectures. After next Wednesday, you'll have 7 advanced lectures. And they are on a range of topics, different cool things. We'll go deep into whatever. If you have specific requests for advanced lectures that you want, like you want to learn about Vue.js or Redux, or you want to learn about deploying to DigitalOcean using continuous integration in Git, or you want to learn about deeper into NoSQL, or you want to learn about something, let Davey know. And then we can, we'll work with instructors and whoever's teaching on a given day to make sure that you guys are getting the topics you want. We have about 25 or 30 that we can pull from at any point. So Nima is normally the one who does React Native, and he's out of town. So I don't know if there's anybody else that wants to take on doing a React Native lecture. That doesn't mean you can't learn it. It just means you may not get a lecture on it. Carl might do it. I'm going to be out of town Wednesday through Friday of next week. So I won't be here when you guys kick off your final projects, but I will be back the week after that. I have to go to Yellowknife. I think I checked. I think it was minus 30 there this morning. Yeah, no one should live someplace it hurts to blink. Week 9, like I said, you'll have lectures every day. You'll be working on final projects. The last day's lecture, the topic is already preset, and that's kind of your send-off lecture. And then week 10, you will not be here. Well, you won't have to be here at 9 o'clock. There won't be lecture for you. Week 10 is another remote week. There are some career services things that you will be doing that week, and Hillary will be the one that will be setting times up and stuff for that. But the good news is, Nick, you won't have to be here at 9 o'clock in the morning. Thursday of that week is when your demo day will be. So basically your demo day is 3 weeks from yesterday. You will have the employer you'll have some career services stuff earlier in the day. You will have the employer demo day at 4 o'clock and the public demo day at 6:30. And then week 10, day 5, which is your actual last day, you'll come in at 10 in the morning, and there'll be a big career services presentation, one last little talk, and then you're done about 2 o'clock, 2, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So that's what the next couple weeks look like. Any questions? Cool. Thanks, guys.